Imagine seeing a mammoth alive, not as a skeleton in a museum, not as a drawing in a textbook, a real one. 6, maybe 8 tons of moving muscle, a body taller than any person in your group, curved tusks longer than a man is tall, thick fur hanging over a huge back in the wind of the Ice Age steppe. Now imagine deciding to hunt it. At first, that sounds insane. If ancient humans needed food, why go after one of the largest and most dangerous land animals on Earth? Why not hunt something smaller, safer, and easier to kill? Why risk a mammoth when there were reindeer, hares, horses, and other prey that looked much more manageable? That question feels obvious, and yet it hides the real mystery. Because ancient humans did not choose prey the way you might choose the least risky option from a menu. They hunted inside a world of cold seasons, migration routes, group labor, limited tools, and constant energy pressure. In that world, the biggest animal was not always the worst choice. So why did ancient humans hunt mammoths instead of easier prey? The first answer is that very often they did not. That is the first correction the archaeological record forces on you. Paleolithic people across Eurasia hunted many animals. Reindeer, horse, bison, ibex, red deer, hare, birds, and fish all appear in the record. In North America, late Pleistocene hunters also took a range of prey. Mammoths were important in some places and times, but they were never the only food source, and they were not the universal focus of prehistoric life. That matters, because the real question is narrower and more interesting. Why, in the places where humans did hunt mammoths, did those hunts make sense at all? The obvious answer is the easiest one. Mammoths were huge. A single kill could provide a great deal of meat. That explanation is true, but incomplete. A mammoth was not just a giant pile of food standing politely in a field. It was dangerous. A wounded mammoth could crush, gore, or scatter a hunting party. A failed hunt could cost time, weapons, and possibly lives. Even after success, butchering and transporting such an enormous carcass would have been a massive task, especially before scavengers arrived. So simple size cannot be the whole answer. The deeper explanation begins with energy economics. A successful mammoth hunt could produce a return that smaller prey often could not match. In harsh environments, especially in cold open landscapes, prehistoric hunters were not merely looking for the easiest animal to stab. They were balancing labor, risk, predictability, and return. One large prey animal could feed many people at once and provide more than just meat. That last point is crucial. A reindeer gives you valuable meat, hide, sinew, and antler. A hare gives you calories. A mammoth could provide meat, a very large amount of fat, hide, bone, ivory, tendons, and sometimes even fuel value in a treeless landscape. At sites such as Mesorik in Ukraine, mammoth bones were used in the construction of dwellings. In other words, the animal was not simply dinner. It could become part of the architecture of survival. Think about that for a second. In a cold environment with limited wood, one successful kill could help feed your group, clothe your group, equip your group, and in some cases even help shelter your group. Now the prey starts to look different, and yet this still does not explain how humans killed something so big. The answer is that they probably did not do it the way popular imagination suggests. Prehistoric hunters were not usually charging full-grown mammoths in open ground in some suicidal duel. Human success came from cooperation, planning, terrain, timing, and selective targeting. At Krakow Spadzista in Poland, archaeologists found abundant mammoth remains associated with Gravettian hunters from roughly 25,000 years ago. The site suggests repeated mammoth exploitation, not just a single dramatic encounter. At Dolní Věstonice and Pavlov in the Czech Republic, mammoth remains are also deeply woven into the archaeological landscape of Upper Paleolithic life. These sites are important not because they prove every mammoth was killed in the same way, but because they show prolonged, organized engagement with these animals. That points to strategy. Humans may have targeted juveniles, injured animals, or individuals isolated from the herd. They may have exploited soft ground, ravines, riverbanks, frozen surfaces, snow conditions, or panic in movement corridors. They may also have scavenged carcasses at times, and that is an important exception to keep in mind. Archaeologists do not always agree on whether particular assemblages represent active hunting, scavenging, or a mixture of both. But the exception matters because it clarifies the rule. If humans eagerly processed scavenged mammoths as well as hunted ones, that tells you how valuable the animal was. The crucial point was not always the exact moment of killing. The crucial point was access to a highly concentrated resource package, and concentration changes everything. One rabbit is easy. 10 rabbits are harder. 20 rabbits may require repeated hunts, repeated tracking, repeated processing, and repeated uncertainty. By contrast, one mammoth could deliver an extraordinary amount of usable material in one place at one time. Now consider another pressure: fat. This may be one of the most underestimated parts of the entire story. Anthropologist John Speth has argued for years that fat was a critical nutritional concern for hunter-gatherers. Very lean meat is not enough by itself for long-term human health, especially in cold conditions where energy demands are high and plant resources may be seasonal or limited. Humans need either carbohydrates or fat in meaningful amounts. Large Ice Age herbivores could therefore matter not just because they were big, but because they could provide the kind of nutritional return that made winter survival more realistic. This is where the story becomes bigger than mammoths. Ancient hunting was not only about danger, it was about energy strategy. A smaller prey species may look easier from a modern point of view because the immediate risk is lower. But lower immediate risk does not automatically mean greater overall efficiency. If your group has to spend more time finding, stalking, killing, and processing many small animals to equal the return of one large animal, then the supposedly easier prey may not be easier in the sense that actually matters. And that is the problem with the phrase easier prey. Easier for whom? Easier in what season? Easier with what tools? Easier for one hunter or for a cooperative group trying to survive a brutal environment? The prehistoric answer was often different from the modern one. Archaeologist Louis Binford emphasized that subsistence has to be understood through organization, mobility, and settlement patterns, rather than simplistic images of hunters proving their bravery. Human beings did not become formidable predators because each individual was physically overwhelming. They became formidable because they were social, organized, and able to turn landscapes into part of the hunt. A mammoth was larger than any one person. It was not larger than coordinated human knowledge. That is one reason the Schoningen spears matter, even though they are much older and not directly tied to classic Upper Paleolithic mammoth hunters. These wooden spears from Germany, dated to around 300,000 years ago, show that humans or close human relatives were already capable of making effective hunting weapons long before the height of Ice Age mammoth exploitation. By the Upper Paleolithic, hunter-gatherers had sophisticated stone blade industries, points, cutting tools, and generations of accumulated environmental knowledge. They did not need modern weapons if the hunt itself was structured intelligently, and they were not choosing in a vacuum. Consider the Mammoth Steppe, the vast cold grassland ecosystem that stretched across large parts of northern Eurasia during the Ice Age. In such landscapes, large herbivores often moved along understandable routes tied to grazing, water, season, and terrain. Predictability matters immensely in hunting. A dangerous animal that can be anticipated may be a better target than a smaller animal that is scattered, elusive, and nutritionally less rewarding. Now consider another comparison: bison. Across prehistory, humans repeatedly hunted large herd animals using coordination and topography. Much later than the Ice Age mammoth sites, but still very revealing, the Olsen-Chubak site in Colorado shows how humans could kill large numbers of bison through planned communal hunting. Bison were smaller than mammoths, of course, but the principle overlaps. Human success often came from turning animal movement into concentrated return. The hunt was a problem of behavior and geography as much as force. If you enjoy this kind of prehistoric detective story, subscribe and keep watching. Ancient survival starts making much more sense once you stop imagining it as chaos and start seeing it as strategy. Now return to mammoths. There is also a social dimension here. In many ethnographically documented hunter-gatherer societies, large game is not just food. It is a social event. It can support sharing networks, reinforce cooperation, and create obligations between households. We have to be careful not to project every recent pattern directly into the deep past, but it would be surprising if such large and valuable prey had no social meaning at all. A successful mammoth hunt could have fed many people and strengthened the bonds that made future hunts possible, so the payoff was not purely individual. A huge prey animal could nourish the group and the social system at the same time. Still, we should not romanticize mammoth hunting into the default condition of prehistory. That popular image is deeply misleading. In many places, humans depended far more heavily on reindeer, horse, fish, plant foods, or broad-spectrum foraging. Some human groups probably encountered mammoths only rarely. Others may have used them opportunistically rather than routinely. And there were likely regions where mammoths simply were not worth targeting often. That brings us to the central reversal. Ancient humans did not hunt mammoths because they were too reckless to choose easier prey. They hunted mammoths because In certain ecological contexts, mammoths were not actually the irrational choice they seem to be. That is the counterintuitive answer. If the right terrain helped control the danger, if group cooperation spread the risk, if the animal yielded a huge amount of meat and fat, if bone and ivory had practical value, and if winter survival depended on concentrated resources, then a mammoth might be one of the smartest prey choices available. Not the easiest in a narrow sense, but one of the most rational in a broader one. And yet mammoths disappeared, which makes the story even more revealing. Whatever exact regional combination of climate change and human pressure drove late Pleistocene extinctions, one thing is clear: mammoths were not an endlessly renewable resource. Paul Martin famously argued for a strong human role in late Quaternary overkill, while many other researchers have emphasized the importance of climate shifts, habitat changes, and complex ecological interactions. You do not have to solve the extinction debate to see the consequence. Once mammoths declined, the strategy built around them had to change. Humans adapted again. They shifted toward other prey, broader diets, new technologies, and different settlement systems. This is one reason mammoth hunting matters so much. It is not just a story about one spectacular Ice Age animal. It is a story about what humans do best, adjusting their behavior to the changing logic of an environment. The same species that could cooperate to exploit mammoths could also turn to fish, birds, small game, seeds, roots, and herd animals when conditions changed. Flexibility was the real superpower. Mammoth hunting was one expression of that flexibility, not the whole definition of prehistoric life. So why did ancient humans hunt mammoths instead of easier prey? Because smaller prey was not always easier in the way that mattered most. A smaller animal might be easier to kill in a single moment. It might not be easier to turn into enough calories, enough fat, enough hide, enough bone, and enough security for an entire group. It might not be easier in deep winter. It might not be easier in open steppe. It might not be easier if repeated hunts consumed more energy than one successful large kill. Once you see the problem that way, the mammoth stops looking like an absurd target. It starts looking like a concentrated answer to several survival problems at once. Food, fat, materials, social sharing, predictable return under the right conditions. The real lesson is not that ancient humans were fearless enough to attack monsters. It is that they were strategic enough to understand when a giant animal was worth the risk. And that may be one of the clearest windows into the human edge during the Ice Age. Not superior claws, not superior strength, not superior speed, superior coordination, superior planning, superior ability to turn landscape, season, and shared knowledge into a weapon. That is why mammoths were hunted. Not because they looked easy, but because in the right world, they made sense. And once you understand that, you start to see prehistory differently. The ancient hunter was not simply chasing the nearest prey. He was reading an ecosystem. The group was not merely gambling, it was calculating. The mammoth was not just a giant animal. It was concentrated opportunity in a cold and difficult world. And that is why the bigger question was never really about mammoths at all. It was about the kind of predator humans had become. If you want to keep going, the next mystery is just as strange. Once humans learned how to exploit the largest animals on Earth, why did so many of those animals vanish soon after?